Hi. Welcome to Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. We're going to explore some of the problems or some pictures that express some problems that have led to the condition of what I call the mechanization of art in the 20th century. I suppose we could look at it as a part 4 to the recent series that we ran on that. And why don't we go directly to the first picture, which is by Oskar Kokoshka and is a portrait of the husband and wife Hans and Erika Tietz, an Austrian couple painted near the turn of the century. Perhaps one of the reasons that contemporary artists, and I think of artists in our own time, I think of hard-edged geometric painters, I think of any kind of abstract painter, went in the direction they did was simply because life has been so difficult in our times. Wars, rumors of wars, social upheavals, and Oskar Kokoshka seems to catch that sense of tension, of undermining pressures of society that erode people, that erode our positions in society, our positions in our own minds, that erode our confidence, that erode our beliefs, our belief in life, really, that erode any sense of hope or any kind of positive attitude. And we see in Hans Tietz on the left, we see actually his left arm seeming to be eroded by red hot heat, in a sense. We look at the dance of their hands joining together as if they try to communicate some kind of nervous tension, some kind of strange luminescent dancing of hands that seem almost phosphorescent, that seem almost to rot or decay before our eyes. Portions seem to be in deep shadow, deeply ravened, so to speak. We move up to their faces, to the face of Hans Tietz, professor, I believe an art historian, as a matter of fact. I could be wrong in that. And we look at the intelligence in the head, the sensitive shape and structure of the head, and we look at the inward gaze of the eye, the sensitive, tense parting of the lips. We swing over to the head of the wife, and she seems lost in a deep inner world, somehow more deeply buried than her husband. Her eyes seem almost blotted out hollows, in a sense, and she's burdened, terribly burdened by her life and by the times. This is pre-World War I painting, and the whole picture is scratched with the end of the brush handle with a palette knife, and there's a sense of luminescent eroding and decay in the picture. We look at Salvador Dali's monstrous creation, Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, which are at the extreme bottom of the picture, or Premonition of Civil War, painting painted just as the Civil War in Spain was about to come off, and we see this horrendous symbol of the social state rending itself in its own clutches. And these monstrous images, based upon the monstrous events of the 20th century that we're so familiar with, somehow something important, something sensitive, something very delicate has been destroyed in us, I would say, or desensitized, has been eroded, certainly in the artists of our time who responded to these problems, as Dali did, and we'll see in a moment other artists who failed to respond to it as directly as this, and we've kind of hidden behind aesthetics because life was too difficult. We look at a similar work painted by the Mexican painter Orozco, Gods of the Modern World. And we see the skeleton, legs spread at the left, giving birth to another little skeleton wearing a mortar board, symbol academia being delivered by an academic midwife, another skeleton on the extreme left there with a mortarboard skull. And if we pan the figures at the top of the picture, sort of standing by, we see who the gods of the modern world are. They are the academic dead who distort the realities of life. And at the bottom center, of the picture, we see little fetal skeletons contained in glass tubes lying in disarray among books. So Orozco says, well, not really too much can be done with the conditions of the world. The educators are not educating, or they're miseducating, at least according to Orozco's scale of values, and we're doomed to dusty death. And of course, we've all been in classrooms where it's been pretty dusty and pretty sterile and pretty dead. Max Ernst, in a painting called The Elephant Celebes, Celebes, painted in 1921, a surrealist painting. What can we make of this? Well, it's painted just after the First World War, this horrendous mechanized destruction of mankind. That central image, obviously the key image in the picture, seems a combination of an elephant, a hippopotamus, and a tank, metallic tank. And there's a certain macabre humor in it, perhaps, and it's a little hard to tell what the front of the creature is and what the back of it is. But if we look at that long cylindrical tube, which has horrendous suggestions to us in the post-World War II Nazi gassing of concentration camp victims, that tube comes out of the turret at the top, swings down to the left, seems covered by a little napkin or perhaps a little Lord Fauntleroy sleeve, and goes up to a nozzle that can become a head or a hand, almost light bull horns on it, and one could imagine almost this huge monster incongruously, delicately blowing its nose on a little handkerchief or something of the sort. Tusks protrude from it. Flags at the top of the open turret suggest something of the color of the British flag, perhaps. Max Ernst was a German. And in the upper left, we see flying fish looking like sharks and suggesting perhaps submarines or World War II fighter planes. And there's a falling smoke at the right center of the picture that suggests perhaps a falling plane. And of course, what looks like a mechanized tree trunk on the right, signifying destruction. And finally, the single figure in the lower right-hand corner with an arm helplessly raised, headless, linking its arm to that sinister trunk of the destroying monster of modern life. Isn't that what Max Ernst is saying to us? Wouldn't Edward Kienholz, in the sculpture coming up, done in 1959, called John Doe, doesn't John Doe look like he's had a run-in with the elephant Celebes? John Doe, the arch victim of the time. And who is John Doe? He's all of us. He's the contemporary everyman who's battered and bloodied his head in social brutalities or injustices, who's been maimed and murdered in so many different ways in wars. How does John Doe get about? Because he doesn't have any lower half to his body? Well, he's gone back a peg into, he's become in his second childhood. He's become a child again. He's become helpless in his childishness because of the mortal wound to the lower part of his body, and he rides about in a little baby carriage. The cross of Christ, bloodied and exuding rays of light in a hole in the chest where the heart might be, seems to offer little consolation or little hope for poor, bloodied, battered John Doe. Obviously, Kienholz is using a department store mannequin and brutalizing it and fixing it up according to his own needs and placing it as a construction in the baby carriage to give us a symbol of his view of modern times. It's done in 1959. Not too cheery. Not too cheery, you'll grant. And if you ladies in the audience are sitting there thinking, well, John Doe is John Doe and it couldn't happen to me, wait just 1 minute, because we have Jane Doe by Edward Kindholz, also done in 1959. And what's the fate of Jane Doe? Not too good. We look at that gray head denuded of life, more blood or life juice running down the forehead. And isn't she the proper girl, though? Isn't she nicely dressed for the guests? Why, she's not only the proper hostess, she's also the very dinner table off which they'll all dine. Her little stilt legs, the legs of the table, her dress, a tablecloth, and she's the very model of a modern, not major general, but unliberated woman who suffers the limitations of her personality because of the role she must play as the proper housewife, the proper wife, the proper mate to our rising young executive, who hopefully won't end up like John Doe, a fellow victim of contemporary society as Edward Kindholz sees it, and who, if they're honest with themselves and they look beyond the "you've got a friend at Chase Manhattan" commercials on television to the reality that lies behind the surface of social dealings, dealings with the banks, business dealings, life dealings, who really looks beneath the surface would deny that all is not totally paradise, although probably all is not quite as pessimistic as Edward Kindholz says. Or maybe it is. Is it any wonder if the world is in something of the shape in the 20th century that Oskar Kokoshka, Salvador Dali, Orozco, Ernst, and Kindholz suggest that artists of a different stripe, and actually no pun intended, like Piet Mondrian, the Dutch modern painter who created his version of Cubism in these very admittedly powerful paintings. But if the world is as deadly as some of the others have said, is there any reason why Mondrian shouldn't try to run away from it, shouldn't try to avoid some of this distressing, gut-wrenching, lethal reality that other artists express? And this, of course, is the opposite side of the coin of 20th century artists. Those who, through theory and aesthetic manipulation, and in this particular instance, geometric manipulation, seek to avoid the disturbing aspects of reality. And I've always felt and feel that as striking as a painting like this is of Mondrian, and really as expressive of a terrible passion on his part to not to suffer anymore, to please avoid suffering, to give some structure, some order to chaos as he sees it, that it is too much of an escape to an ivory tower and ultimately can't sustain us. Perhaps too much John Doe's by Kindholz can't sustain us either, but perhaps we need some middle ground where we give the world its due. In 1921, this is Mondrian, and Fritz Glarner in 1956. Fritz Glarner has a substantial reputation as an artist, but and he tastefully arranges Mondrian-esque shapes within a circle, splaying them subtly and slightly in various directions. They're not strictly horizontal or vertical, as you can see. But is that really enough? That's my eternal question, as you'll know, those who have watched the program for a time. And I think it's an important question. I don't think it is enough. I think that we have to go beyond this. We have to come back in some kind of contact with reality that is neither sterile, as these are, nor overly cynical and pessimistic, as some of the earlier ones were. We look at Max Bill's intertwining of identical colored sections, done in 1967. There are endless examples of this kind of work that really don't express anything. One could give psychological interpretations of these, the black square and the yellow square and so forth, but white square and purple square, but it's not really profoundly done, and so it won't really touch us and won't touch future generations of artists. The great problem of contemporary artists is to overcome contemporary sterility. Joseph Albers devoting a great portion of his life to a series Homage to the Square, this one in 53, this one in 59. Terribly limited. One can say the work of, well, perhaps a limited man, but also what must be a terribly desperate man to focus in on a square within a square within a square for that sake of ultimate stability at all costs, all sense of human irregularity, the pulse of the heart, the flowing of the lymph system, the twitching of the nervous system, there's plenty of twitching these days, the flexing of muscles, all eliminated for the sake of a sterile containment and stability, very deceiving and very dangerous stability. How about Gene Davis in 1966 in his Moondog? I mean, I'm sorry, but I think this has very little to do with moons or dogs. Dogs howling at moons. Wasn't there a blind singer called Moondog? I think this is about stripes of color laid side by side. Attractive color. Some advance, some recede. There's a pulsation, but none of this is enough to satisfy us or fulfill us or give meaning to our lives in a time when people seem so alienated from themselves and from the world. Excuse me, if our artists are any example. Agnes Martin, last few years, received a certain amount of publicity from curators of museums and gallery people. Her Falling Blue in 1963, I believe, reaches the ultimate nullity. One can talk about the exquisite sensibility that produces these subtly scribed lines that give the textural effect to the piece, but can anyone honestly say at the end of the modern tradition that this offers us any kind of spiritual, emotional, or psychological substance, or even intellectual substance? I find it completely empty, and despite knowing what she's trying to do, very boring, very tedious. One of my favorite painters of all time, Barnett Newman, in his Vir Heroicus Sublimis, painted 1950-51. And we can be very, very glad that he spent 2 years working on this heroic, sublime statement of an orange-brown canvas, 18 feet long. Aren't we impressed with the quantity of it? Quantity, of course, is an exquisite substitute for quality these days. 3 stripes, exquisitely arranged with each other. Kenneth Noland, June, 5 feet by 9 feet. The warmth of June, perhaps, framed for our edification, forcing us to concentrate, and as contemporary critics would say, to put ourselves into the expressive vacuum and void of the picture, forcing us to create the picture, forcing us to paint the picture, forcing us to be a part of the picture. Couldn't it just be said the other way, that since Nolan has so little to say, since there's such a terrible vacuum of meaning in the picture, we're forced to have to do something with it. We're forced to have to say something about it, to pretend that there's something there when there isn't. Perhaps Kenneth Nolan lives in Ralph Going's Airstream trailer, painted from a photograph in 1970. Isn't this, in its absolute technical slickness and gimmickry and obsession for surfaces, in its coldness of execution and feeling, the absolute equivalent of these sterile, hard-edged geometric paintings we've been looking at? Isn't there in the photorealists, Ralph Going's picture in this instant, removed from a first-hand experience of reality, that difficult devil that we have to deal with? The removal from reality and taking your work from a photograph, the same removal from reality in the cold, hard-edged handling of the geometric painters. I see them as really much a part of the same group of artists. Keep in mind the coldness of this, the slick, tinny, metallic quality of this, the lack of any substance of form. This is the illustration of shape and form, not the creation of it that the great artists like Rembrandt and Cézanne create, or Picasso creates. Can you imagine the following people living in this trailer? Daumier's drawing called Soup. Look at these hardy, primitive, salt of the earth, gutty, robust people. Peasants, workers, gobbling their food, the steamy pot in the center separating the drawing, ink drawing into light and darkness. The baby gobbling at the breast that takes the soup down. Look at the irregular lines of character in the bodies, the heads of the figures, man and woman. Look at her neck. We're a different breed of people if we live in that trailer or we paint that trailer. Can you imagine these people in Soup going out to eat at the Circus Drive-In by Richard Estes in 1971? This picture painted from a photograph, and for all the technical expertise that Estes has and Goings has, it becomes really an exercise in futility, because the Circus Drive-In, as eye-catching and exotic and bizarre as it is, well, I guess maybe it isn't a drive-in. It looks like it's a Best of Burlesque I see advertised up there. It's a casino. Okay, can you imagine them going to gamble there at the Circus Casino? There's a Travelodge there. They wouldn't stay at the Travelodge either. For all the technique, one misses the soul of the object, the way one would find it in a Van Gogh church or a Cézanne building or a Corot building or a Rembrandt windmill, because it's painted from a photograph. Look at the difference in the reality, the gutty reality of Courbet's Apples and Pomegranates, painted in the mid-19th century. Can't contemporary artists once again reapproach reality in their own way, search out the character of forms instead of slick, smooth surfaces? Are we going to continue to mistake surfaces for the form of the object? I would suggest that Courbet has got both the rotted, gnarly surfaces and the powerful, solid forms. Can't we go back to the human figure and capture it in its casual moments, as Degas did in this nude, a pastel of a nude combing her hair, where we get a feeling of forms working in a beautiful design, but also something of humanity? Can't we go back to the landscape as Corot did, not painting it as Corot did, but responding to it as 20th century human beings would, not from a photograph, but really trying to get the feeling of forms, solidity, life, and expression for our own time. As Pissarro did. We get a little picture frame, along with his Boulevard of the Italians in Paris, capture some of the beauty, the clamor, the raucousness of urban life in our time, along with beautiful design, beautiful aesthetics. All these artists have beautiful aesthetics, but they also have the world and us, people. Another Pissarro, Lane into the Village. We don't have to paint his style, but can't we respond to the reality of it, of space, of substance, of color, of light, of atmosphere, in our own way, rediscover it for our own time? How shallow is the following picture compared to this by Paul Klee, Park at Lucerne. How attractive, how decoratively attractive. Interesting shape-wise, pleasing color, but ultimately shallow and sterile because we need more than simply manipulation of color of two-dimensional shapes, no matter how rhythmic and charming they are, as this is. Compare this to another gutty Pissarro station at Pange in France. Look at the wonderful freshness of the feeling of the air, the solidity of the ground, movement of the track, the solidity of the buildings, the tremendous design of this with that sweeping curve of track. Can't we look at our everyday activities, our entertainments, us in all our positions of work, play, rest, as Lautrec did in this marvelous masterpiece of the Moulin Rouge, a masterpiece of design, of color, of shape relationship, of light and dark, of realistic observation and emotional response to reality. Can't we respond as Winslow Homer did in a painting like Eight Bells, the wonderful mood of men facing the sea in solitude and yet together joining forces to experience it? This is the question I ask as we conclude this program. Can't contemporary artists have the courage to make the first moves to discover a significant art based on the visual and emotional responsiveness to our time? Program's Artist and Critic, I'm Don Gray. Thanks very much for being with me. Bye-bye.